Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Raven. Our guest today is Andrea Jones. She's a principal at her firm, her company, Andrea Jones Consulting. Andrea has focused on efficient and effective project management and change implementation for over 20 years. And like me, Andrea also loves process improvement. She has a natural instinct for always focusing on seeking a better way to execute work. So before I tell you a little more about Andrea, let me first say thank you. I'm glad you're here. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you again for having me, Mark.
Of course. Andrea began her career at Intel Corporation. She was a process engineer, and there she learned, she grew to love the use of data, the analysis of data to make recommendations and improvements. And she has an educational background that's similar to mine. So, like me, she has an MBA from the MIT Sloan School of Management. She has an engineering master's degree from MIT. And we'll give a shout out because we were both in a program called Leaders for Global Operations. So, you're the second guest to join us. Michelle Parrish, who was a previous guest, was also a graduate, yet a different year than ours. So, really glad that we can we've got that shared educational background, but you've got really interesting experiences that are different than mine. So I'm glad we can explore all of that today.
Sounds good.
Andrea's website, if you want to learn more about her and her work, and we'll mention it again at the end, is andreajonesconsulting.com. So Andrea, as we normally do here, we dive right into asking a story, thinking back to your career and your different things you've done. What's your favorite mistake?
Yes, thanks for asking, Mark. So, thinking about this, and of course, everybody makes mistakes, and there's tons of them. And I know you've said this is really not every mistake or a litany, but really, what's the one that you maybe learned from the most? And that's kind of what I focused on thinking about this question. And I'll tell the story. So back to finishing that program, the LGO program, many years ago now. I came out of it. I was working at Intel before I started the program. They sponsored me for the program, which meant that they financed my way through the program, which was very generous, and I was super fortunate. And of course, I had to work for them afterwards. And so I got out of school and went back to work at Intel. Previously, I had been an engineer in the factory, as you sort of mentioned, a process engineer.
Mhm.
And I thought, oh, I have an MBA, I can do marketing, which, maybe I could do marketing. But at the time, I started back at Intel, and I had been in the marketing group for not, very long, maybe several weeks. And they had hired a consulting firm to evaluate sales and marketing and decided that they were too large and were going to offer certain people voluntary separation packages. And I think the mistake, Mark, so you can kind of see where this is going. I was offered a voluntary separation package after Intel had paid for me to go through school within 2 months of returning back to the company. And it was a huge, I would say, shock at first. And context in the way of a mistake is, I think, really the mistake, and this is probably true in many of my future mistakes that I'm trying to get better, is thinking that something like that would not happen to me, right? How could that happen to me? Um, and so looking back on it, when I first was told I could take a voluntary separation package, and I had the opportunity if I wanted to maybe look for another job within the company, but I left that process engineering role for a reason. I know we'll get into some of that later. So I decided to take the option to leave, and it was a little while before I got over it in terms of my ego, I will say. And when I say a little while, probably years. I mean, things were going well. Because after I left Intel, I started looking for another job, and this is where the learning from it came. I had really been focusing my career at that company, great company, super fortunate, like I said before, but hadn't considered the wider world. And so experiencing that and being sort of thrown into the wider world, I discovered this role that I'm in now, which is consulting. And the reason I really started it is, I started thinking about what I wanted in my life and how I wanted things to go. My husband and I had only been married for a few years. We wanted a family. And so I decided to start my own consulting company. Born out of that, mistake of kind of thinking some sort of, failure like that would never happen to me, turned my life into a completely different direction. I'm very fortunate looking back.
Yeah. So did you join Intel right out of undergrad? Is that right?
I did. In fact,
Yeah.
I finished undergrad and then I did this master's program. Before MIT, I did another master's program in chemistry.
Mhm.
And it was with the University of Oregon. I think they still have this materials science focusing on semiconductor processing. So I had an internship with Intel while I was getting my first master's. And then I worked for them basically full time, took night school for a year, and then finished that up and started out of Intel. So yeah, it was really my first job.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it sounds like you had been in many ways like very committed to the company. They were committed to you, like you said, sending you to MIT was a great investment that they made in you. But so I'm curious to hear just a little bit more of when you're saying, well, yeah, that wouldn't have happened to you. Was there like you said, it took a while to get over it. Was there sort of an emotional hangover from that? Did that affect
Yeah,
your
I mean,
ability to move into other things, or what was the impact of that?
right, that's a good question. I don't think it affected my ability to move into other things. I feel like I was able to pivot relatively quickly, a couple of months. But I do think that it left a bit of a scar, kind of that, gosh, if I was that smart, if I was that good, why would they have asked me to leave? Why wouldn't they have just put me in a new role? Why wouldn't they have,
Mhm.
tried to groom me and things like that? And so I think that sort of lack of humility maybe is
Yeah.
the best way to describe it. I had to get over that, and I do think that that's common, and especially for people who have accomplished a lot and have done a lot of things. And I right now where I live here in Portland, Oregon, there's a lot of folks who have been asked to leave other large companies in the vicinity, and a
Mhm.
friend of mine who's asked to leave a company after 20 years of service, and it's a very real feeling, that blow to the ego. And I think it's very normal. And I think it's also a great growth opportunity. But as
Mhm.
far as stopping me from doing other things, thankfully, I don't think that was the case.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And when you think of, I mean, like to me, I think the mistake here. I mean, I think of you could argue Intel made a mistake. That they had invested a lot in you, and you were, clearly a high potential employee for them to make that investment. Why would they perhaps lose track of you? I'm thinking of, a friend of mine, a good friend of mine who was also a classmate in my year at the Leaders for Global Operations program. Um, Somebody could Google it and figure it out. So I'll just say it's Dell Computer. I don't mean to throw them on under the bus, but similar large global corporation. And my friend, similar background of engineering, had been working in that type of role. She took a career development opportunity in where marketing. And then I think a couple of months after that, Dell really had their first large scale layoffs, and she, I don't think it was voluntary. She was swept up in that. And then I think this is, big company dynamics. She was laid off, and then at some point afterwards, somebody else in the original part of the company that had hired her learned about this and was really upset. Like, how'd you let that happen to her? And so I think that was Dell's mistake. I know more about what had happened there. So I mean, there are, and it's I'm not trying to say, well, this happens to other people, Andrea, so therefore it. I don't know if that makes you feel better or if it makes you feel worse, like these
Well, at this
these
point,
these
I'm definitely
dynamics.
over it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think you're right. The mistake could go both ways for sure. And it's sad that large companies, good people can get swept up, like you said. Just it's a numbers thing. It just has to be cut. They're not really looking at individuals. Um, but that kind of has shaped the way that I've worked going forward with my consulting firm, right? Which is
Hmm.
we we do we call it the time value of life, and we really prioritize that people have a whole life outside of just what they're doing for work. I think that work is very rewarding. Meaningful paid work gives people self-esteem. It's values their human dignity. It's a creative outlet. You feel like you're offering something to the world in a way that's obviously valued because you're again getting paid for it. It just doesn't have to be all or nothing. And the Intel job was very all. It was time consuming. The factory was, you had to be available at any point during the day and not just the work week, also the weekends. I don't believe that culture has completely changed from some of the
Mhm.
engineering departments. And that's not really always conducive with real life. And then, you think that that's the only thing you can do is work all the time, but really, the option is to just not work at all. That's the
Mhm.
alternative. And what I've learned over the years now is that's patently untrue. There are so many ways to make work, fulfilling work,
Mhm.
happen in between those two extremes. And so I've kind of dedicated AJC to that mission, which is, working with amazing, educated, experienced people who have something to offer to the world by way of employment and meaningful work, and pairing them up with companies who need that skill and expertise, but not necessarily on a full-time basis. And we have been so fortunate to find clients that share that value and able to
Mhm.
provide that type of service.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd like to hear more about that. And for context, I work mainly as a solopreneur, if you will. I sometimes work with other firms. You've built a firm with a lot of people, so that's a whole different level of commitment and responsibility. I mean, I was wondering if you can tell the audience, kind of more about building that firm and how have you maintained that sort of balance of focusing on the time value of life as a mother, as a wife, as the owner of the business.
Yeah, that's a good question. Building the firm was, I would say, accidental. So when I first started consulting after I'd left Intel and I decided to try for it, I thought, we wanted to have a family, and I don't want to be beholden to a company if I'm going to be taking maternity leaves. Who knows what's going to happen? Maybe I need some time off. Maybe I don't want to work full time. So it was really at first a vehicle for me to continue my career and have this family. And then at the end of 2014, I joined a group called Vistage, which is a peer advisory group, and became part of a network that had exposure to other business leaders in the area.
Mhm.
As a young mother, I did not have time to do a ton of networking. And this is something I think a lot of people, not just parents, but a lot of people struggle with is if you want to do the independent work like you're doing, Mark, you have to be building your book while you're
Mhm.
delivering the work, and it's very challenging.
Mhm.
It was almost like a sinusoidal, right, feast or
Yeah.
famine curve. It was either you're on and working and not doing biz dev, or you're not working and all you can do is biz dev.
Yeah.
So when I joined this group and I started getting exposure to potential customers, the business started to grow just by virtue of that. I was being referred, which was very fortunate.
Mhm.
And I was bringing in people, and they were moms like me who had also been at Intel and couldn't, live that lifestyle when they had their family. And it was kind of overflow. I didn't set out to start a firm, and I had some peers that had been consulting, maybe more toward the tail end of their career, that they gave me some bad stories about managing people, how hard it is, and you're dealing with people all the time. And I was like, ooh, I must not want to do that. So that might have been a mistake too, because I think I had the blinders on at first about that. I was like, oh, I definitely, it was bad for these guys, so it'd probably be bad for me.
Mhm.
And that was a mistake, because I love managing people, and it turns out that I really like people, and I really believe in people, and so you know starting to work with other people and growing the business and bringing in people now as employees, I find that the only reason I'm continuing this business many days is because of the people. If I wasn't serving these people and I didn't believe so strongly in how much they have to offer, I just don't think I'd do it. So, it's a time in life kind of thing. I don't know if I could have had the time while we were actively still having newborns to grow
Mhm.
the business. It didn't actually start until, my youngest was one, the growth. But now looking back, I wish I would have maybe at least been open to that earlier,
Mm.
because it's just very rewarding.
Yeah. So was part of that, you mentioned moms in particular. Was that meeting other women who were kind of looking for a similar type of work life integration or wanting to do a job that they cared about but didn't have to be a full time, yet alone 24/7? Intel, like you said, running literally around the clock by the nature of their business. But did you, was it a matter of how, oh, I'm curious, let me ask you a different way. The balance between you were doing good work, clearly, because that's what leads to referrals, you're busy, and meeting women that you could describe as talents. You've got client needs, you're finding talent, you're like, I can try to put them together? Was it a little bit
Yeah.
of both?
Yeah, and again, at first it was women that I had personally worked with when I was at Intel in the factory, other engineers,
Mhm.
and that's how it started. And then it just grew by word of mouth because once you start telling people, "Hey, would you like to do, well-paid, intellectually challenging, meaningful work that helps somebody else 15, 20, 25 hours a week and not have to find it yourself?" It's like, we call it fondly the unicorn of work. It's like the almost impossible thing that it's
Yeah.
really hard to find, but it's actually out there. And so
Mhm.
people would, my employees would refer other people to me, and then we'd start
Mm.
just networking and talking, and people would come. And even now we're talking to people. The hardest part sometimes is there's not enough work for everybody who would like to do this type of
Mm.
work.
Mhm. Yeah.
So then my mission now is to grow the business because I want to provide that type of work for people who want to do it.
Yeah. Have I wonder if well, so I'm curious, what's the effect of the pandemic? Does a lot of consultant myself and others have shifted to more of a virtual model? It's not that traditional kind of full-time on-site model. Does Has a shift to more virtual work made it easier to do work that's a little more part-time for these individuals?
Absolutely. Yeah, we were very fortunate in the sense that we have to have a pretty lean and mean overhead model. Mark, I'm sure you can appreciate that. So we don't have an office. We've never had an office. Everybody's always worked from home or gone into client sites when necessary. So when the pandemic hit, it was just instead of doing one or two meetings a week at the client site, you were just doing them over this type of channel, a
Yeah.
virtual channel. And that was not hard for us. We were set up that way. We all had our, infrastructure in place. Also, we help put in place as project managers, you mentioned before, and process people and change people. We help with all kinds of change, one of them being moving people into cloud-based systems, where now turns out that anybody who didn't already have a cloud-based system really wanted one.
Yeah.
So we were just fortunate to get some of that work. So the pandemic's been great. And then I look at the moms, not everybody who works for me is a mom, not even everybody is a woman. Um, but the moms I do have, with the kids being at home for school, I have four kids now. They're in seventh grade, fifth grade, third grade, and first grade. It is not easy when they are all home and you're trying to
Mhm.
get them on their stuff. Trying to hold down a full-time job while doing that is next to impossible. But trying to maintain 15 to 20 hours a week is totally possible and a welcome break, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there times from a managing client expectations standpoint where do you have to sort of sometimes draw some boundaries and make sure that if somebody's working well with a client, there might be a tendency for that work to then expand.
Yes, there's always that. And our team is very talented, so that does happen. I can't say we're perfect. We have a couple of things we try to do. One is we try to provide an account manager for our clients, which is either myself or Barry, my head of operations, so that if that type of scope creep does happen, the consultant can tell us about it and they don't have to go to the client and push back, because it doesn't feel
Mhm.
good to have to do that. And then vice versa, if the client, you know, has some sort of feedback for the consultant, they can tell us, and we are
Mm.
able to mediate that with the minimal amount of, conflict or emotional response.
Mhm.
So that's
Yeah.
been very valuable. And then I think everybody, I'd be curious to know if you've experienced this in the last year of doing these interviews. People just kind of understand now. Whereas before,
Mhm.
you kept your home at home and your work was work, and
Yeah.
heaven forbid that your kid would interrupt you in the middle of a call. I mean, that's just life. That's life, and people are very, very gracious about it, I would say, these days.
I've found that. So I mean, that's an interesting point where I would say anymore it would really be viewed as a mistake for somebody on a Zoom meeting, Zoom conference call, um, to get upset or snippy about the dog barking or a kid coming in the room. I think generally people would say, "Hey, look, these are challenging times. Have a little grace. Cut people some slack." Will that extend back to circumstances of work-life balance that aren't as visible, like when that child runs through the screen, like that's really clear and obvious, and like you might say, "Oh, the kid's cute. No, it's okay." Back to a regular workplace where somebody needs time away from work, for what might seem like sort of an invisible reason. I wonder if people will continue extending that grace, or
I
if it's
hope
going to
so.
be different.
And I'm glad you're bringing it up because I think there is a huge opportunity that we have to allow for a bit more flexibility, whether people are in a full-time role or not.
Right.
Um, you know, it's not inconceivable to say, here's the expectations I have for, results, right? Presentations to be done, this to be ready, whatever, and by these times, and then let adults figure out how to do it. Um, Seems reasonable to me. That's how we've built our business. So I guess you know, I think setting really clear expectations up front, if you can, will lead to that. And I'm very hopeful that companies will start to offer those types of opportunities to be flexible
Yeah.
and maybe look at it as more of maybe an agile type approach. Like instead of thinking somebody's got to be on all the time and how much can we cram into their work week, it's what are the most important things that we need to get done as a team and how can we pull off the top and constantly be re-looking at that, but have, shorter increments of work so that we can pivot when the future changes because it is going to change. And I bet everybody now has a global pandemic on their risk mitigation strategy for the future, whereas probably not very many folks had it on before.
True.
So hopefully we can see some of that through into the future. Have you seen other companies starting to look at that?
In terms of the flexibility
Mm-hmm.
dimension, yes, but it's still in the context of the times that we're in right now, as we're recording this in late April of 2021. So, there's a software company I'm involved with called Kinexus that is still extending a lot of that flexibility of where people are. Some people have relocated across the country to different time zones for different reasons related to their family or to their life, and the business keeps going on. So there's been additional flexibility extended that way, and I think that's just always been part of the mindset and the approach at the company to give flexibility, to not micromanage details about how and where and when
Mm-hmm.
the work that gets done. Like there's some work, there's some meetings that have to be done in a synchronous way, and then there's a lot of work that doesn't have to be. I think a lot of that's born from the CEO, Dr. Greg Jacobson, who was one of the early guests
I
in this
listened to that
podcast.
one, yeah.
He's an ER doctor who still occasionally works some ER shifts during the month. So they might be night shifts, or occasionally it's a 24-hour shift. So there are times when his schedule, everyone else has to give him some grace around, okay, Greg's not available this Tuesday because he's worked a 24-hour ER shift the night before, but he's still effective as a leader and as the CEO, and things go on. So I think because he's got some of that circumstance in his own professional life, he's a good guy where he isn't going to ask others to do something he's not
Right.
doing himself, or not creating a separate standard for others. I think that's just good leadership,
I
that he's
agree.
exhibiting.
It's nice. And employees can see that he has something that's very meaningful that he's passionate about doing outside of this business, and they can take that as a role model and example. I
Yeah.
think that's great.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I do hope we get to still experiencing each other in person. I think the ideal model for us, or maybe me personally, is if we could kick off projects in person,
Mm-hmm.
right? Spend a few days together, have a meal together, build some rapport, some friendships and context around each other's lives, get to know each other.
Right.
And then after that, I think a quarterly refresher is pretty much, I wouldn't say all you need,
Mm-hmm.
and this is certainly not every project or every situation, but it does feel like if every 90 days you can get to see each other and re-up
Mm-hmm.
that tank, after that you can go for a little while
Yeah.
and be a little more productive. Um, the other thing I want to mention, because maybe companies will listen to this and think, yeah, it's really hard to be that flexible. We're still paying people XYZ, and if we're not getting that type of productivity out of them, how can we afford that?
Yeah.
I actually think that people are willing to take less pay for this type of flexibility. I
Mm-hmm.
really believe that. My people, we don't pay full-time salaries. We can't do that. We're not billing people
Mm-hmm.
full-time, but they're very happy to, obviously be compensated, fairly compensated well for the hours they work, but don't need that crazy excess. People are realizing that, again, the time value of life, you're just not going to get it back. I took my kids to the pool last Friday afternoon because there was an in-service day and the kids have a half day. And I mean, Friday afternoon, I'm picking my kids up at noon and I'm taking them to an outdoor pool. You can't do that with most employers, but I'm not going to be able to do that with them all the time. I want to do that.
Mhm. Yeah. One other question I wanted to ask, you'd made reference to it, that your team is not all moms, it's not necessarily all women, that you do have some men on the team. Have you found that is similar circumstances where there are men, whether they are dads or not, where there's a similar appeal to having the flexibility of doing a job that would normally have to be a full-time job
Hmm.
on a less than full-time basis?
We had a dad on our bench, and his wife was a radiologist, is a radiologist. So he was in a sort of flip model situation and loved the model. We have two gentlemen that are maybe they've worked a full and productive career and are like, and I think this is another wonderful and unexplored untapped resource or demographic, is the almost retirees. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you've been working full time plus for 40 years and you don't want to step away from it completely, you have a lot to offer, but you also don't want to push those kind of hours anymore. We
Yeah,
have some folks in that situation, women, men. I think it's great, and
yeah.
and our clients are benefiting from their expertise.
I've seen that work really well. There's a large, really well-known, lean management process improvement firm that it's not exclusively their model, but generally they'll take somebody who's been a plant manager, vice president of manufacturing. They take an early-ish retirement from their company, and then they can, at least at the time, they could choose, did they want to work how many weeks a month?
Hmm.
Full time, 3 weeks a month, 2 weeks a month. I don't know if they let anyone work just 1 week a month, but yeah, I think it was a similar type of thing. So and then I'd be curious to see as expectations evolve for different reasons. Are there younger people whose personal family overall situation makes that compatible for them too?
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things people want to do in life. I don't think everybody thinks it's all about money these days. If they ever did, right, that might have just been a perception.
Yeah, yeah,
um, and for us too, right, we could obviously be a more profitable company if I was pushing everybody out at more than full-time billables and paying them all salaries and recouping the excess. I mean, that doesn't feel good. It doesn't sit right. It doesn't align with our beliefs at all. We want to be doing this for helping people and feeling like we're really contributing.
So again, our guest has been Andrea Jones. Her firm is Andrea Jones Consulting. And one other thing I'd like to touch on before we wrap up, because I know we have a shared interest in this idea of thinking about change as a series of experiments. So I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on what that means to you. Why is that important?
Yes, thank you for asking. I think that life is about trying things and recognizing that they're not always going to turn out the way you thought they would, maybe when you got started. The consulting company, case in point, right? I didn't think I would consult. I thought I would be at Intel. I didn't think I'd have employees. Turns out that's great. I love it. Um, and I think, you've probably heard people say fail often, fail quickly, fail fast. But the difference is you have to be ready to admit that, right? And to really accept reality. So if you can say this didn't go well, and mea culpa it if it's your fault, and almost
Right.
to a fault, if you can admit or accept some level of the blame, especially as a leader, I think everybody will be much more open to having a productive conversation about what really happened without getting to that feeling of I'm being blamed for this and fear, and gets you past it faster. And it's just like you said, it's an experiment. And I think Simon Sinek is now going and calling this an infinite game. Have you heard this new phrase from him? Because
No,
he got a
no.
book. That work and life in general is an infinite game. It's not a game where there's a finite point that you have to win or lose, right? It's going to keep going. So because of that, we get to experiment. We get to make these mistakes. We get to try again. And if we can admit that and show that level of vulnerability with those around us, especially in leadership positions, everybody's just going to get there a whole lot faster.
Mhm.
And I love that, right? I make little mistakes, every single day.
Yeah.
Like just this morning, I sent out an invoice without putting a specific piece of information on it that I probably should have put on it, and I will not make that mistake again. I mean, just little things that happen. But without being open to knowing, yeah, I'm fallible.
Mhm.
Maybe that's the whole theme of this. I can make mistakes, and it's going to be okay. It's
Yeah.
going to be okay. And we're all in it together. If you can have a team that's there to support you, all the much better, and it's just human.
Mhm.
And we're all in it together. We want to help each other be better.
Yeah. We all make mistakes. And I mean, this harkens back to more, I think this was Richard Nixon Watergate era phrase. It's not the crime, it's the cover up. And I'm not saying mistakes are crimes, but like you said, when people are pressured, when there's a culture of fear where they can't speak up, then that means mistakes just keep going and perpetuating. Like, yeah, I don't know all the details about it, but I saw a story from Ontario, Canada, the other day, where the headline was, 6 patients had been mistakenly injected with saline instead of vaccine. Now, the vaccine from Pfizer gets diluted with saline, and so at some point somebody discovered, and I'm guessing that there are process checks where what I do know from looking at vaccination sites is that the vials are tracked and counted very carefully for traceability, and it's logged on your vaccine card and all that. So at some point, there must have been an oh bleep moment where somebody realized, okay, our count is off. We've got this vial, and what happened, and somebody was able to trace through and figure out we must have injected them with saline. Like this couldn't have been necessarily observed, but you would have to kind of kind of problem solve your way to figuring out that must have been what happened. Now, I'll give credit, whatever the dynamics were in that organization, like clearly somebody felt safe to speak up, because otherwise you think of the harm to those 6 people if somebody had felt ashamed, embarrassed to the point where they somehow covered that up. Those are 6 people now who think they're vaccinated who were not. So, I mean, I think, some people might look at that story and say, well, how could that happen? Well, to your point, Andrea, people are human. We can try to design systems that make it impossible for somebody to make an error, whether it's with the invoice or something like vaccination. And that's why we explore that so often here on this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
anyway, just
appreciate this
random,
podcast
random,
part.
random, random sidetrack.
Well, I think it's great that you are shedding light to this topic, right? Like my favorite mistake implies that there's a lot of good that can come out of mistakes, and that's very true. So thank you for doing it.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for being the guest and sharing, not just your story up front, but as you've gone through this experiment of starting a business and then starting to grow it in a different way. And I'm sure at some point that first, well, I mean, it sounds like you had a solid hypothesis, but there were experiments with the part-time model, and it seems like that's working out actually. Yeah.
They're all experiments. I mean, we've learned so many things. I would take years to go through all of them.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you agreed to the experiment of doing the episode today.
Thanks again for letting me participate.
Thank you for doing it.
All right, take care.